The IPA website editorial board welcomes you to our webinar on training models. Thank you for being so many to participate and from so many IPA societies from all regions. As training is closely linked to the transmission, the preservation, and thus the future of psychoanalysis, it is the main debate issue from the psychoanalytical institutionalization. Our contributors today are two eminent psychoanalysts, Alain Gibault and Jorge Canestri. They will give us their understanding and discuss with us for a better clarification of training models, their philosophy, and their psychoanalytical principles. During the presentations, you can post your questions. Each one, Jorge Canestri and Alain Gibault, will present his ideas for about 20 minutes. After their presentation, it is you, attendees. You will have a 45 minutes discussion. So, for doing so, you can post your question pane on the right-hand side of the screen. They will be answered in the question and answer session after the presentations. I would like to introduce you now Alain Gibault. Alain Gibault is a philosopher and clinical psychologist, training analyst of the Paris Psychoanalytical Society, actual president of the Educational SPP Committee, past president of the European Psychoanalytical Federation, past Secretary General of the IPA, past director of Kestenberg Center for Psychotherapy. He is honorary professor of the Lomonosov Moscow State University, author of a main key report on symbolization at the French-speaking Psychoanalyst Congress in Paris, author of the book Paths of Symbolization, and co-editor of an anthology of French psychoanalysis, Reading French Psychoanalysis. Alain, please.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And so I will speak mainly about the French model of training and making naturally links with other models, but especially the Eittingham model. When we read some of the results of the EPF Working Party on education, we can all agree on the aims of the educational process. I see that you can read, those who want, the paper on the website. In the selection of candidates, it was stressed that, I quote, receptivity, curiosity, and psychological mindedness were major subjective criteria to evaluate and warn against selecting obedient candidates rather than creative, challenging ones. Mira Ehrlich-Ginor in 2010 in Psychoanalysis in Europe. Our methods of training would thus value both the intellectual and the emotional aspects of learning, end of quote. The training analysts who were involved in the research wrote that our educational process should aim, and I quote again, building strength for the vicissitudes of life as an analyst, developing reflectiveness, coping with painful feelings and limitations, and they added, listening capacity was important with respect to one's own feelings and thinking, as well as to the patient. Becoming able to interpret was what happened with the patient was important, and to be able to learn more of this from a supervisor. The candidate should be able to discover the unconscious and analyze transference and repetition compulsion. The commitment to a deepening of contact with their own unconscious and of response to patients was seen to require the candidates to learn more theory, to improve formulation, and to learn well in a group. End of quote. When the candidates were asked to describe what working as an analyst is about, one of them said, and it struck me, and I quote, "Both our emotional and intellectual knowledge is meant to increase and deepen, together with a stronger capacity to tolerate uncertainty." End of quote. We think that we would all agree with the definitions of these aims in the educational process. Then comes the question, how can we work in our institutes in order to obtain these results? Since the IPA has accepted the possibility of considering 3 models of training, it is interesting to study how each method is promoting this educational process without a dogmatic attitude, which would be stating that one method, one model would be better than the other. There are advantages and disadvantages in each method, and we think our discussions should aim at clarifying these issues in order to see how each method could benefit from the study of the other methods and imagine possible changes for the benefit of each models. A question is raised when we distinguish different models and observe the diverse implementations of each model. If we speak of the French model, one must distinguish the one used in the Paris Society and the other French-speaking societies, already then in France, and in other foreign countries like the Belgian and the Swiss Society. I would say from this point of view, all training broadly are comparable in their philosophy, but there are differences between them with regard implementation. So we'll come to more, I would say, thinking about the French model. On his website, the IPA presents a document entitled Requirements for Qualification and Admission to Membership. It is divided in 2 parts, conceptual basis of the 3 models and implementation of the 3 models. We will consider the main difference between the French and the Haitigan model, which lies on 3 issues. Naturally, there is the Uruguayan model, but it's more or less a compromise between the 2 other models. So, what are the 3 main issues in the French model? First, the frequency of sessions. 3 sessions in the French model and 4 or 5 in the Haitigan model, till the recent decisions of the IPA board, the last IPA Buenos Aires Congress, to also accept 3 sessions. However, that decision is much controversial and has been criticized, especially by the European societies using the Haitigan model. We can here mention that the issue of the 3 sessions in the French model has been a political decision and not a scientific one. When Sacha Nash, one of the post-war pioneers of the Paris Society, created the Paris Institute in 1953, a training analysis was, like for Freud, 5 or 6 times a week. But Lacan was already at that time reducing the length of the sessions, and he was sending many candidates for training. As he was expelled from the Paris Society in 1953, Sacha Nash proposed to analyze the future candidates 3 sessions a week, thus giving the possibility for the training analysts to analyze 2 candidates in 1 week at such a frequency, instead of only 1 at 6 sessions a week. Later on in 1995, it was decided that there would not be a training analysis as such, and any member of the Paris Society could do the analysis of a future candidate. It must also be mentioned that in the French model, an analysand can apply for analytical training only after 3 years of personal analysis, which is thus always a therapeutic one. There is no pre-selection. In the 90s, the frequency of session was already a controversial issue, which led the APF to create a committee on the setting chaired by Jacqueline Godfrey Aber from the Belgian Society, and it was promoted by me. At that time, I was vice president of the EPF. In the report published in the EPF bulletin, you can read that in 1992, number 39, the bulletin is called Psychoanalysis in Europe. Jacqueline Godefroy stressed this idea. I quote, "The same setting will thus have different meanings for the analysand and the analyst, according to the analyst's inner conviction and habitual practice. For example, where an analyst adopts a setting of 3 sessions a week, reduced from 4 or 5, the meaning will be different from the meaning of the same setting applied by an analyst for whom 3 sessions per week is the norm." End of quote. This report was discussed during all day by the Council of the EPF and the members of the committee. There's a report in the same bulletin by Betty Densler. Recently, after the vote of the IPA board in Buenos Aires, Catalina Bronstein, president of the British Society, wrote a paper which she presented at an EPF meeting last September with the title, "The Heitingham Model as to why 3 is not equal to 4 or 5. So the same issue was thus underlined as in the EPF research a few decades before. But one has to distinguish between scientific arguments and political decisions, which involves other factors like the evolution of the socio-economical situation in many countries and its influence on the practice of psychoanalysis and the training of psychoanalysts." So it was the first main characteristic of the French model. The second one, following the French model, a strict separation between the personal analysis and the training itself in the institutes, while in the Heitingham model used, for example, by the British Society, the analyst is invited to give his agreement for the candidates to begin his first supervision. Therefore, something which is a corollary, there is no obligation in the French model to be in analysis during the training. It is a very important difference with the Heitingham model, and we can reflect on the consequences. These issues have been much discussed during the last decades in the annual conference of training analysts within the European Psychoanalytical Federation, which have often been centered on the question of reporting and non-reporting system. The practice of report by the training analyst has been abandoned. But the only possibility for the analyst to say yes or no to the future candidate may be felt as an intervention of the institution on the process of the personal analysis. However, even without a direct intervention from the institute on the personal analysis, there can exist other interferences from the external reality on the internal reality of the analytical process by the analyst's more or less encouraging attitude in the candidate's personal analysis to begin a training, which can hinder the analysis of the wish to become an analyst and the issues involved in the analysis of the negative transference. This is one of the analyst's dilemmas in the analysis of a future candidate. The wish to become analyst should be seen as a symptom to be analyzed, although what the analysand says about his professional choices cannot be directly linked to the unconscious determinants of these options that will emerge in the course of analysis. This wish is in fact bound up with the hope of fulfillment of all infantile wishes, whether narcissistic or object-related. Whereas analysis entails a quest for the absolute associated to the magic fulfillment of wishes and the narcissistic regressions involved in the analytical process, the analysis leading to a training holds out the prospect of a coincidence between fantasy and external reality. Hence, the difficulties, contradiction, and paradoxes of the transference-countertransference relationship in the dialectic between the individual therapeutic process and the institutional process. In certain cases, the wish to become an analyst may form part of a struggle against infantile dependence and helplessness, coupled with the hope of putting a stop to the suffering resulting from the conflicts inherent in otherness. In this situation, and I'll quote a colleague from the Paris Society, Jacqueline Cosnier, who wrote a long time ago, becoming an analyst is confused then with the acquisition of a professional identity in lieu of a self-conquest not achieved in the subject relationship with infantile objects. The analysis of the transference neurosis can lead to a deadlock because the paradoxical analytic goal is actually to gain power so that infantile helplessness never has to be relieved. And then I come to the third main difference. Contrary to the Heitinga model, which is more or less structured like a university curriculum with compulsory and optional courses, as well as regular written reports by the supervisors and directors of courses, the French model proposes a training without any obligatory seminars and written reports, only the supervision, which are obligatory, naturally, which thus favors the freedom of choices and the candidate's personal responsibility. However, it leads for the candidates to some longer trainings and to a feeling of being isolated. This will be the negative aspect of the model. One can ask if the French are reticent about structuring more the candidates' training if it's not related to the concern about favoring their creativity without too much intervention from the institution. But this issue is a more general one and not only linked to a specific model. In a recent EPF forum on education in November 2016, Dennis Flynn, who is responsible of the Students' Progress Committee in the British Society, was also aware of that issue, and he wrote, as Bion notes in describing the growth of the container in order to bring about learning from experience, there is a requirement to avoid rigidity and be able to work with uncertainty and doubts. Many candidates come up during their training to points of difficulty, but such points can be points of growth. End of quote. The question is thus raised, how do we reconcile the development of uncertainty and doubt, which is a common aim of any model of training, in the personal analysis and in the teaching of our institutes? Since it is frequent to say that our institutes always run the risk of infantilizing candidates, what would be the optimal and necessary conditions in order for our training models to favor the acquisition of uncertainty and the acceptation of the unknown inherent to the analytic experience, while leaving a place to the structuring role of our institutions? Is there not always a possible violence of our institutions on our candidates in the idea of infantilization, which would deprive them of the necessary freedom for the exercise of their responsibility? The evolutions of the terms used in our institutes bears witness of such a preoccupation. In the French model, it was progressively decided to use the term superviseur, supervisor, instead of contrôleur, controller, which has the meaning of to control, and analyst en formation, analyst in training, instead of élève, pupil or student. In the IPA document on the three models, the terms used are applicants, postulants in French, for those who are applying at an institute, and candidates, in French would be candidat, but it's a French term which is not so much used. The British also use the term student, étudiant, which refers to the university teaching. So I think I have 5 minutes. So I would like to raise just some present problems that we encounter in the Paris Society with regard to training of candidates. It's a way to show that the model, it's an abstract concept, and we have to take into account what's going on. In the structure, the Paris Society has 2 institutes, one in Paris and one in Lyon, and a Southwest Training Center in Toulouse, which is part of the Paris Institute. There are 9 subcommittees, there was a mistake in the written paper, which are part of the overall education committee. 7 in Paris, 1 in Lyon, and 1 in Toulouse. We use the word Commission du Cursus, training committee, for the specific work of these subcommittees. Each subcommittee meets every month to work on the selection interviews of candidates. And there is a subcommittee in Paris for foreign candidates, which meets twice or thrice a year. Meetings of the training committee are so held when needed at a lower frequency for the qualification of candidates. So I would like to just present some of the problems that we are presently facing in our institute. First, a progressive fall of the number of candidates. At the Paris Institute, from 286 in 1998, we have now 203 candidates in 2016, and at the Lyon Institute from 67 in 1998 to 33 in 2016, thus for the two institutes from 353 to 236. Second, difficulties for the candidates to find patients for their supervisions. In Paris, 49% of the candidates have waited more than 1 year, even 2 years, to find a first case of supervision. In Lyon, 12 candidates on 22, thus 54, have waited more than 2 years. Third problem, aging of the population of the candidates. At the Paris Institute, 45.6 years old for the beginning of the training and 51 years old for the average age of the candidates. At the Lyon Institute, 45.3 years old for the beginning of the training and more than 50 years old for the average age of the 3/4 of them. Fourth, the length of training, an average of 7 and 8 years at the Paris Institute and 8 years at the Lyon Institute. 5, a fall of the number of training analysts at the Paris Institute from 69 in 2010 to 55 in 2016. At the Lyon Institute from 14 in 1995 to 10 in 2016, for a total number of training analysts of 65 for the Paris Society in 2016. And also, the last problem, aging of the population of the training analysts. The average age of the members of the education committee is 71.3 years old. So I would like also just to mention other problems which were raised by the answers to a questionnaire which was sent a few years ago to the training analysts and the candidates. The answers to the questionnaire raise also some issues related to our modality of functioning. First, we have a way of working in our institute, which when there are some candidates of whom we are not sure that they are good candidates, we prescribe what we call cursus suivi, followed training. It means that they begin an individual supervision, and after 1 year, the supervisor gives reports to the training committee. So it's interesting that during the last years, there were 59 followed training in Paris and 64 in Lyon, so a majority, which shows the need to be more present in the training between admission and qualification. So if we consider the second point, which is an issue raised by the questionnaire, the frequent interruption of the first supervised case. 54 of the supervised cases in Paris, a situation which obliges the supervisors to find another case for their supervision. It can take between 3 months and 1 year, and quite often 2 years, thus making much longer the length of the training. Third point, the necessity to plan a treatment in 2 phases. First, a psychotherapy face-to-face, and only later an analysis on the couch for 53% of the cases in Paris and 40% in Lyon. And also, the obligation for the candidate to diminish the amount of their fees in order to find a patient, 57 in Paris, 67 in Lyon. This raises the issue of the gap between the fees asked by the supervisors to the candidate and the fees asked by the supervisee to his patient. This gap is increased when the candidate is not paid or paid at a very low fee when he sees his patient in an institution. So, and the last request was an important request of the candidates to have more seminars on the study of Freud's work and on the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, which shows the need for the Institute in the Paris Society to give less freedom at the beginning of the training and maybe recommend and oblige to take some seminars and courses. This is one issue, and especially I consider that there are three main issues which should be obligatory in the Paris Society. Naturally, reading Freud's work. Second, an experience and seminar on first interviews, and a seminar on the fundamentals concepts of psychoanalysis. So you see, this issue of the freedom of choice is a main problem. So I think I arrived at the end of my time. So we have been facing some solution in order to be more in contact with our candidates, and we have proposed some different ways of dealing with these situations, but I don't have time now. So just to finish, I would like just to say something which was, I would like to quote from the result of a recent research of the IPA Institutional Issues Task Force. It was sent to us in 2016. This report gives the results in a feedback from a survey sent to the entire IPA membership over the course of 2015. One of the themes discussed concerns the relationships between members and candidates under the title Intergenerational Conflict and Harmful Interaction. I will finish by quoting this. There is much anxiety about the survival of the IPA and the psychoanalysis it represents. The need to protect against the fear that an irrelevance is predominantly played out in the area of psychoanalytic training. There are widespread feelings of having been injured, shamed, ignored, and mistreated by training systems. Some of this becomes focused on the training analyst's position and posture as a source of potential injury and signifying the overall rigidity of the training system. The intergenerational issue consists, on one hand, in the older generation becoming increasingly rigid and petrified due to its anxiety about loss and the survival of psychoanalysis. And on the other hand, the desire, enthusiasm, and passion of the younger generation to join in this project, yet feeling mistreated, not heard, and ignored as a life-giving force. End of quote. So naturally, I think our discussion today can help us to go beyond those, I would say, reserves which were presented by this task force. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alain, for this so clear and so interesting development. Now I will introduce Jorge Canestri. Jorge is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He specializes in linguistics and epistemology. He is a training analyst for the Italian Psychoanalytic Association and for the Argentina Psychoanalytic Association. He is actual president of the European Psychoanalytical Federation, former director of the Institute of Psychoanalysis of the Italian Psychoanalytical Association, professor of Psychology of Health at the University Roma III, invited professor to the Nanterre University, co-author of the Bible of the Unconscious, Mother Tongue and Foreign Language in the Psychoanalytic Dimension. He is author of one of the main reports at the French-speaking Psychoanalyst Congress in Milan in 2003 on psychoanalytical process, and he is associate editor of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. Jorge, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being here. My presentation will not be so well organized as Alain's presentation, because I said to Alain that his presentation was so good and so well organized, looking at the French system, but also making a dialogue with the Eitingon system, that I consider unnecessary to repeat all the questions that he is so well explaining in his presentation. I want just to make an interaction with his ideas regarding, yes, first of all, the differences that are well described by Alain. My own definition, if you want to, about training, is that training is an attempt to awaken an interrogation, to suspend certainties and bind them to a project of knowledge that is personal, but is also scientific. I underline but, because there is always a discussion about the fact that the psychoanalytical training and experience is essentially a personal one, and I agree, but there is also a question of scientific knowledge, and there is also a question, if you want, of a profession that is something that is also very discussed normally, and I will not enter specifically in this question. A French colleague told me once, oh, finally I understood what does it mean, the Eitingon model. And said the Eitingon model is an immersion. And I said, you're right, that is exactly the idea. The Eitingon model is a structure like an immersion that, as Alain remembered in his speech, implies being in analysis the training, and implies being in analysis with a high frequency of sessions, implies having supervision, having seminars, and having also, and this is important, we don't have a reporting analyst in any one of the moments of the training. But we have, obviously, as in the French model, a possibility to supervise which kind of training we are doing and which kind of student, if you don't want to call it student, you can call it candidates. I will say something about words in a moment. Which kind of student or candidate we are training, and for doing what. Then this system implies necessarily this kind of immersion. That is the best description I ever find about the characteristics and the qualities of this model was a paper written by Ines Smith, a Belgian analyst that published this paper about the tripartite systems and the Eitingon model on the bulletin of the European Federation. And it's an example, if you read it carefully, of how you can conceive an interactive psychodynamic system of training, because that was exactly the idea, an interactive psychodynamic system where analysis and what you can call examination. Here, Alain mentions, for example, the university system. In a sense, you can compare the Eitingon model with a university system, but in a very, very relative sense. The only thing that is like in the university is the organization of the seminars, essentially. But this is important. What I learned from Alain is that they consider now that there is a problem in the kind of system they are using, because not being too organized means also to leave the candidate in a situation, as Alain said, of solitude, and also an arbitrary choice of what to learn or what not. I want to quote something that happens many, many years ago when I was directing for the Italian Society a piece in the section in the journal of the Italian Society called Historical Critical Notes on Psychoanalytical Concepts, and happens to me to ask to someone, colleague, very respected colleague, to write an article about one concept. Method of the others. That means you must describe the history of the concept, beginning obviously with Freud and following till nowadays. And what happened? He said, oh, listen, this is not for me really, because in fact, I never studied seriously Freud. I just study Bion. If you want, I can write something about Bion, but not a kind of article like this. This is exactly what we don't want for our candidates. And I'm very happy hearing that it's important to impose a seminar on Freudian ideas from the beginning to the end. Well, the question of words that I said before. You know, there was in 1997 an EPF training colloquium called Transmission of Psychoanalysis in the Present Day. And I provoked the audience saying, okay, the name is okay because it means nothing. That is, transmission is a neutral word until you say what do you want to transmit and how do you want to transmit. The other words, Alain mentioned several words that we use for that, all have a meaning. If you speak about training, French people will say, and many others, not only French people, what an ugly word means, like someone that is making footing in the morning to prepare for making sport. It's true, but train is also a way of saying in English what we understand by educate. But educate is a very dangerous word because, you know, that means exactly, coming to Latin, ducere is to conduct. But if in Italian you listen ducere, you will clearly hear duce. That means the leader, Mussolini in the case of Italy. That implies a power. That implies that you are guiding or obliging someone to do something. And there is a question that Alain mentioned, and it's important, of creativity. All of us want candidates with a lot of creativity. But sometimes the question is that you must also organize knowledge. You must have an scaffold to use to help to give a direction to that creativity. There is a nice book that I recommend of an American colleague. The title is On Trying to Teach. Listen, trying to teach, in the sense that Freud said that there are three impossible things to do to govern to teach or educate and to psychoanalyze. And many times we said that the three impossibilities are all condensed in the training of a candidate, because we must govern an institution and give rules, the scaffold for creativity. We must analyze, and we must also teach. And he remembers something that is very nice also by the way he described it, is the question of the discussion of the famous historian of art, Sir Joshua Reynolds, who said that was very important to be very rigid, and everybody must learn all the rules and all the aspects of what is to make painting. And the chapter is called On Creativity, Discipline, and Other Desiderata. And the question is that also a dean of the Harvard University said, if the students have a lot of sparks of creativity, what is very important is to put a lot of water there. And then he passed to the history as the water sparker of all the initiatives that are not exactly following the rules in the university. Today we consider obviously that this is a nonsense and that we can put together both things, but it's important to think that we put together both things, not to arrive to the situation when someone could finish the training saying, listen, I never studied seriously before, I just studied beyond. Then the question also regarding the models is what are representing the models? There is an intervention of Anne-Marie Sandler, an intervention of also this several years ago, saying in the Congress of Helsinki, that means 1981, she said the formal differences between systems, that means models of training, cannot be discussed without taking into consideration the basic differences in the philosophy of training, in what we intend psychoanalysis should be. And this is first, it's not after. We must have in mind what we think psychoanalysis should be. And after our taking that decision, we could discuss about the philosophy of training that many times, as James Smith and others said, is normally implicit and not explicit, and many times misunderstood. The discussions we had in the last period about different systems increasingly shows what a lot of misunderstandings there are about the philosophies of the system. The question is that if you listen Alain's presentation and what I'm saying, I can say that Alain is making an approach to the IT system because he's speaking about the possibility of make more rules and assistance to the candidate. That is to integrate more in the system, things that normally were considered against the liberty and the creativity of the candidates. And this is a problem that has to do, I love very much a philosopher and a man who studied the history of science in China a lot, Joseph Needham, who said, why Occident has always a philosophy of or this, why we cannot be organized and creative? why we cannot teach to our candidates in a regular, organized way, following also an idea of what kind of psychoanalysis we want to have, and at the same time improve the creativity of the candidates. This is not an option or this or this. In the idea of Joshua Reynolds, the idea was only rules. The idea was that the opposite was Rainer Maria Rilke writing to a young poet, saying, do what you want because everything must come from you. But you can put together creativity and organization. And this is the idea of one of the differences probably of both systems that we could discuss. Another thing that I think is very important, and Alain says that very openly, and I appreciate that very much, also in a discussion we had 1 year ago in Paris. The question that the basis of the French model and the decision to change the Eitingon model was essentially political decision and not a scientific one. And this, at this time, where we are discussing again about models, it's important to moderate the discussion, first of all, to try to create a dialogue, and second, to try to study the models with a scientific idea, and not just because we have political reasons to act in one way or another. Take an example. One, he said clearly, we asked to our candidates, you need patience for your training, reduce your fees. But we must say also to the supervisors, reduce your fees when you are working with the candidate if you want to make survive psychoanalysis. Because all the questions he mentioned that are the problems in France are exactly the problems in Italy, the problems in Spain, the problems everywhere. We are old. We are aging constantly. Our training analysts are very old normally. Our candidates are old. They finish their training when they are, if everything works well, 50. I finished my training when I was 30 or 29, I don't remember. Which is the life, the scientific life and the clinical life of an analyst that begins theoretically to work when he is 50 or 55 years old. Which kind of creativity also we can expect of people at that time. I think that these things must be considered seriously because if we studied, and I studied when I was a child, international new groups, the growing or decreasing of the societies in the different regions, I said very clearly, the only region that is growing is Europe, not because we in Occidental Europe are more able than others in other regions, just because we include the east of Europe that first was not working, and then our growing was very fast, and we must be grateful to them for that. Then this is a problem that we must consider seriously, and that we can do things to change. The other thing that I consider important, and it's not, in this case, this is a criticism in the Alain report, is the fact that 60 years ago, Jacob Arlo, in a meeting in the United States, said one of the main problems of our trainings is the cultural gap. We didn't change a word of our system of training and the content of our training since the Berlin Institute in 1920. And I will add, it's not exactly true. We decrease the quantity of things we are teaching in our institutes regarding the training of the Berlin Institute, and could be very interesting to go to listen and to read carefully the story of the Eintendon system, beginning with the Berlin Institute, where they teach religion, history of religions, history of art, anthropology, and so on. We will not teach that nowadays, but we do teach biology, as if biology was always the Freudian biology. We don't teach epigenetics. We don't teach neurosciences. We don't teach quantum physics. We don't teach nothing that has to do with our real life and knowledge today, as if psychoanalysis is something eternal that is there and never we will touch it again. And this is like the growing and aging of our societies. Okay, thank you very much. I think that I have finished my time.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for this brilliant discussion presentation. Now it's the time for the question and answer session. And I would like to start with the question of Sergio. So, do any of you know about Rio 2's Institute monthly meetings with group of candidates called Accompanying Group, where each group of candidates can talk about the training and issues they can share about during training? Who want to start?
Well, go on, Jorge. Or I may say something. I don't know this group in Rio, but it means that we have to consider what the candidates are expecting from our institute. And it's true that if I consider what had been going on in our society, in the past, candidates were not so much asked what were their opinions about the teaching. Now they are more taken into consideration, and we have also meetings only for groups of candidates, not regular, not each month. This is something different, but I think it's a very important issue to take into consideration what they think, what they expect. Myself, when I see some candidates when they are qualifying, it's very interesting that they are requesting changes in the way that we are working with them. And they ask, why don't, it is the case in our society, why don't we speak ourselves at the time of the qualification process? It is something which is done in other societies. I think in the Eintendon model, the candidate is asked to speak. It has never been the case in the Paris Society. So you see, now things are evolving, and I think it's one thing which shows that the different models are taking into account what the others are doing. And I think I'm very glad that Sergio raised that issue, because I think it is very important nowadays to ask their opinion.
Yeah, may I say something? Eliana, may I say something?
Yes.
I agree, in fact. As you said, Alain, for example, in my Italian association now, but from the very beginning, the candidates must do a presentation at the moment of the evaluation and the approval of the quality of associate members. But I'm coming in my training from a society, the Argentinian society, where we organized many years ago a revolution of the candidates, asking to the training analyst and to the training committee to have a committee of candidates participating actively in the decisions about teaching, for example, in the society, what we wanted, what we needed. And I think this kind of thing that Sergio is saying is very important in that sense, because the participation of the candidates implies also the fact that the candidates have a responsibility of what the institute is doing and regarding the kind of training they need, they want, and they can discuss. In 2001, in the Congress of the IPA in Nice, where I was the scientific chair, participated for the first time a candidate. That it was a Polish candidate, Ambowski, and we were really happy, and we will have a big help coming from the candidates that he was represented about how they see could be a Congress of psychoanalysis and which can be the place of them in a Congress after was always done.
Okay. So another question in the continuity. As a newly qualified member with the Vienna Society 11 months ago, I think the main problem is not the training model, but the different ways candidates are infantilized by training. This occurs in every training model, and to me it seems this has more to do with how the training committees look at their candidates. I think that the more the candidates are encouraged to take part in the society, they can decide themselves how to go on. So my question is it more about the appreciation of candidates and about rivalry? Thank you both for your interesting presentations. Who wants to answer first?
Well, I spoke in my presentation about the risk of infantilization in our teaching, in our institutes. And I think there are many ways to infantilize. One way would be to say you don't have to be involved in any way in the teaching process. You have to obey what we say and follow the courses. Sometimes it is maybe in some society very more structure and maybe felt more authoritarian than in other societies. We have to find a good balance. That's what I think is important between the feeling of being able to be creative in our work with the candidates and for the candidates in their training. If you are involved in the training as if you had to obey everything, you won't be creative. There should be a balance. And it's sometimes not so easy between what is personal experience and what is the structure of the institute. There is a balance to find. And I think our discussion about the models concerns how we can protect the personal experience, not only in the analysis, but also in the training itself, while at the same time giving a role to the institutions. It is a very important issue, and I think in the supervisions, it is something which you mentioned, Jorge, in your paper about transmission, the parallel, I would say, process between what's going on between the candidates and his patient and what's going on between the supervisor and the supervisee. This parallel process is a very interesting thing, because in France, it has been one, I would say, inheritance of the Lacanian influence. You see, the Lacanians have been very reserved about the influence of the institution. And so they have been promoting the personal experience. And for example, in the fourth group, there was a training in which they called the fourth analysis, analyse quatrième, in which there was no selection. And it was only the supervisor who was in a way selecting the candidate and was in fact maybe sometimes been working with some candidates who were not candidates. They were analysts and they were eventually accepted or not accepted, but it was a way. And I think the hypothesis was to protect the creativity, but in a way it was felt as something which was lacking the third party role of the institution, because it's a third party, the institution. And it is something which has to be, for example, between a supervisor and the supervisee, there is the patient and the supervisee, there is the supervisor and the supervisor, but there is also the group of the supervisors within the institute. And so this has to be, I would say, worked through in order to go beyond what we could call infantilization. Well, I could go and give more details, but I leave Jorge now to answer.
Yeah, I think, for example, that an important point that was underlined also by, in the United States, by David Sachs, the fact that we, in a system like this, we give a lot of power to the supervisor, because the supervisor in a system like this is the only one who could say something about the candidate, because the analyst cannot say nothing because it's non-reporting. And then the question is, we must integrate the fact that there must be, and that's why the I Think On system tries to create an immersion where there is a dialectic interaction between the systems, that the teachers of the seminars, the supervisor, must have the possibility to say something and not to leave only to the supervisor the responsibility to say this can be or not an analyst. Another issue that seems to me very important is, as you said, the question of power. But on the other side, I must say something that probably will not be very good for many candidates. The candidates sometimes have a lot of compliance, because the idea is, I'm a candidate, I must become an associate member. And when there are associate members, I must become a titulaire in France, or I must become a full member, and after I must become a training analyst. Then, which is the time to say, no, I don't agree? And curiously, in that sense, the candidates have a lot of compliance sometimes, saying that they agree with things that they don't agree really, and we know that. And after that, saying that there is an exercise of power of the institution. That is true, but it's true that it's also on the other side, not to be compliant, and to have the possibility to say, no, I don't agree. Diana?
Yes, what is the next question?
I don't have a micro. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There is a general question that I would like to ask both of you. Which do you think are the reasons or the origin for the infantilization?
Well, just what Jorge has said, the issue of power. There is an authority there's a function of authority in a society, in an institute. So there is the difference between an authority which is, I would say, giving a space for democratic discussion within the organization, and each other system where you would not be able to have such democratic way of doing, and there will be, I would say, an authoritarian attitude in the society. And I think, you know, that's what Otto Kernberg has been much, I would say, discussing. You know, he wrote a very provocative paper which was mentioned by many of us about the authority. You know, his paper, it was in 1986, 30 methods to destroy the creativity of psychoanalytic candidates. So the title is very provocative, but it shows that, you know, if you have an authoritarian situation in our institute, then there's a risk of infantilization, because it's a dual relationship. It's not a third party one. I really believe the third party issue is fundamental, naturally, in psychoanalysis itself, and also in the functioning of our institutes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. I agree with Alain. I said something before about the fact that you need to give a participation to the candidate and to give them the possibility to speak. That is very clear. But you must also take into account that courage is not exactly something that everybody has. And then compliance is easier in that sense. It's easier to see people who says, I agree. Overall, if on the other side, as Alain said, there is an authoritarian teacher, or there is also, like in many societies, we could see analysts that are like le maître à penser in France. You don't discuss with someone who is the biggest representative of something and could, in that sense, treat the others as if they are children, as in a sense Otto Kernberg said. Then this must change the structure in itself, the mentality of the institution. In that sense, also an American said, take into account that normally in any kind of institution, there is a sociological analysis of how the institution is functioning, never the psychoanalytic institution. Why not to do a good sociological psychoanalytical analysis of how is functioning an institution that must form analysis, because it's such important task.
I will go on with another question.
Yeah.
I will go on with another question. So, the new generation of candidates in some North American institutes reflects what Bolas described in his plenary address published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalysis in the Age of Beleitlerman. He talks about these candidates under the influence of social media who have prioritized information over knowledge and thinking. We have several such candidates in our classes. I and some of my colleagues fear that changing the Eitingon requirements will create a new breed of psychoanalysts who will abandon what Jorge Canestri called scientific knowledge. Is there any way of preventing the above? I think it's for Jorge first.
It's important to understand, to prevent, what does it mean exactly? Because you cannot prevent what is happening in the sense that, for example, the introduction of new ways of communication and also of knowledge, we could discuss after which kind of knowledge it is present everywhere. We cannot prevent that. We could try to work with the candidates in the sense of reflecting. For example, in that sense, I think that the idea of teaching Freud, not only because Freud is Freud and is in the foundations of psychoanalysis, but one of the qualities, nothing new, but I say, of the text Freud is the possibility to explore again and again a text. Text like also classic works that have give the possibility to explore and to find a lot of new things. If I'm working on one of these texts that is called in English The Uncanny, that is one of the texts that Freud wrote and is full of a quality of argumentation that is very peculiar, in the sense that he is creating a dialogue with the others, but also with himself. If you work on this text from different point of view, like any other text, the Unheimlich presents a lot of things that you could share with the candidates in order to make a reflection. That depends on who is teaching and who is reading the text. Your way of teaching and reading a text and showing that you are able to reflect on that and not just to take an information like when you click on Wikipedia, implies another way of working on knowledge. You can teach that. This could prevent, if you want, to create a quality of candidates that when you ask them, tell me, what are you reading? They are unable to say what they are reading. Because reading implies a kind of work that is not just touching on Wikipedia as normally we are doing when we need a quick information.
Yes, speaking about knowledge, this question evoked the fact that changing the Heidegger model would change something about the transmission of the knowledge. I think it's when we are psychoanalysts, the knowledge is something which is dependent on the way that we understand what is psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is something with a dialectic between a frame and a process. But we have different ways of understanding and conceptualizing the process. And this is one of the reasons why we can understand that in the British society, they are, I would say, in difficulty with regard changing the Heidegger model, because their way of, I would say, understanding the analytical process, I think is a little bit different from the way, for example, in France, it is conceptualized. It's not only an issue of frequency of sessions, because then we are lacking what is very important in the practice as well as in the transmission. Just to say something which can be certainly an issue to work on. What I see is in the conceptualization of the process, for example, in Great Britain compared to what we do in France? I would say that in France, it's a way of not considering suffering as something which should be very immediately treated and considered as an expression of the resistance. That's why sometimes in that conception of analysis, we speak of micro-analysis. The analyst is following the expression of the anxiety, for example, and does not leave space to develop too much, because we fear that this development of anxiety would be a threat to the analytical process. In the French way of thinking, it's considered that anxiety should not be, I would say, tackled in order to prevent it from developing too much. There's space for leaving the anxiety, which could be activating the unconscious derivatives to be a part of the analytical process. So this is something to understand and to deepen in our researches in the differences. And there have been, and there still is in the, I think Jorge has been much working on those aspects in the EPF. There are working parties trying to compare the different processes. And I think this is very essential in order to not to be trapped in this situation of only the frequency of sessions being what is important in analysis.
I want to say something that implied in the question, in the previous question, was for me also the question of scientific and the question of truth. In the sense that if you read a book of our French colleague Laurence Kahn, called in French L'analyse apathique, that is now translated in English, there is also a chapter that mentions the question of how progressively the psychoanalysis will seem to lose of truth. And this is a serious problem, in the sense that you introduce a question of relativity, everything goes, that seems to, there is no one truth, and if you are making a comparison, you can say nothing about what is this idea compared with this one, which is better, which is nearer the reality. And this is dangerous also. Also, this must be prevented, because it's a way of going in, sometimes in psychoanalysis, that seems that the same to say different to say different. And you mentioned, Alain, the question of the working parties, the idea of exploring the implicit ideas has nothing to do with the ideas of everything is relative and it doesn't matter what you can say of this theory or this other. This is a, we can say, it's a way of thinking that is postmodern, but it's
There's cuts. There are cuts. There are cuts. I didn't understand. I didn't hear what Jorge has said. There are cuts in the transmission.
You didn't understand what I was saying. No, I was saying just that there is implicitly a question of truth in the question of scientific. We discussed by years about the scientificity of psychoanalysis. The first question, like the models, the different models, is which kind of science we are talking about. But this implies the risk of saying everything goes. It's the same, this theory, this other theory, this way of doing, or this other way of doing. I'm against this kind of idea. In that sense, we are saying that our French colleague Laurence Kahn wrote a book called L'analyse apathique, where there is this point of relativity and the danger of this absolute relativity is present in psychoanalysis nowadays, and also in the training of the candidates. What is the sound that is?
I will go on, maybe, no?
Maybe you could go on with another question.
Okay. It's a question about the French model. Do analysts trained in French model ever work in 4 or 5 times a week setting? Maybe it is seen as not useful?
Oh, well, I can easily answer that question. I myself did an analysis 4 times a week, and I analyze patients sometimes 4 times a week, and I still have patients 4 times a week. Some of them, they have become candidates on our analyst, and I did their analysis 4 times a week. Sometimes, for some different reasons, I propose 3 times a week because there are some difficulties to propose 4 times a week. I can say that in France, many analysts have been working 3 and 4 times a week, and my supervisors, I remember René Diatien, Evelyn Kestambert, they were always saying, if you can do 4 times a week, do 4 times a week. But you know, this is the practice, but there are the rules. And the rules is that, well, it's good if you can do 4 times a week, but the minimum rule frequency is 3 times. So myself, I consider that if I can do 4 times a week, it's easier for the patient, it's better for the analyst too, because the continuity in the trans-counter-trans relationship is, for me, something which is more positive. But sometimes we cannot do that. And we have to consider what is going on now in the world in which we live. It's true. We often hear that you cannot find patients coming 4 or 5 times a week. But you've seen that one of the difficulties which were discussed, that it is difficult to find patients 4 or 5 times a week. I can say that in France, the results of our surveys shows that it is also difficult for our supervisees to find a patient 3 times a week. But there is something of the, I would say, personal experience of the candidates in their own analysis. If somebody is convinced that 4 times a week is better, it's eventually easier to find patients accepting to work 4 times a week. But then you have to, sometimes, very often, that's my experience, to lower your fees. I always have had the experience that if you lower your fees, you can propose 4 times a week. But you know, when I was in the EPF board, I remember there was one president of the French Association, and we were discussing the problem of reimbursement by the state and the difficulties of the issue of reimbursement of analysis. And he said something which I always have remembered. What is good for psychoanalysts is not necessarily good for psychoanalysis. So I thought that it is something which we have to consider now when we are speaking about the fees.
Obviously, yes.
Jorge, do you want to say something?
Or just something that I remember when you were speaking about we are in the difficulties with that the candidates have now, and the fact, for example, that they begin with an analysis with the patient and the patient interrupts the analysis and it's so difficult to find another, and so on. We must consider that the difference also is the fact of the kind of patients we have now for the candidates. that were not surely the normal neurotic patients that were recommended in the past when we have trained. I remember, for example, that I asked to a supervisor a third supervision of a psychotic patient, saying, I know that the institution does not admit psychotic patients. But if you say nothing and you accept to supervise this patient, I will be very happy. And I learned a lot, but was a very particular case. Normally now, the candidates have such a kind of patients that normally interrupt the treatment, and they must begin again and have a lot of problems. We must consider also this is a problem nowadays.
Okay. Thank you. One more question. Alors, the arguments that were raised against the change of the frequency from 5-4 to 3-5 sessions, which I read in the material the IPA sent to us, were, in my view, not convincing. I would like to hear if, how, fewer sessions can be linked to the quality of analysis. If we consider that more sessions lead to a better analysis, then we are faced with the following issue. Are we going to have two different analyses? One, a better one with high frequency for candidates, and another one, lower quality, fewer sessions for our patients? Which could be the repercussions in case of a change from the Eitingon to the French model? Who wants to start?
Well, first, it's not this issue of the session, number of sessions, it's not a change from the Eitingon to the French.
No,
there are differences. You have to understand they are different. And naturally, it's not also an issue of one is better than the other. 5 times is better. 5 times can be not positive sometimes with some patients. It can be positive with some patients. 4 times also, 3 times also. You see, you cannot say something without taking into account the fact that you are seeing very different patients with different mental functionings. And well, in France, it is something we have always have considered, the necessity to take into account different frames to work with different patients. I myself have been, and I'm still working with very severely disturbed patients, borderline and psychotic and schizophrenic patients. But I can say that we have to consider changes in our way of considering the frame in order to help them to do that work. For example, we do much psychotherapy face-to-face, 1 or 2 sessions, and not necessarily analysis when we have severely disturbed patients. You can have other ways of seeing things in other ways of conceptualizing the analytical process. We have different ways, different cultural traditions. And what is interesting is that we have this multiplicity of possibilities. Psychoanalysis is not something closed, it is something open. And that's why I think the models are not there to, I would say, oppose them, but to see how they can be in a dialectic, in a way of seeing what in other models can be eventually interesting for the other models to adopt. That's would be that's what I try to show in my paper.
Jorge, one minute, please.
1 minute. I get to say, okay. 1 minute. I was trying to say also all the time, we cannot consider things separate. We are speaking about the system that interacts inside psychodynamically, and this happens with Eitingon model. I cannot consider only the question of 3, 4, 5 sessions. I must consider the complexity of the system. Complexity is not the same as complicated. the complexity means that one part depends on the other part, and this happens in a system like this. And I must say another thing that you mentioned, Alain, when you mentioned Jacqueline Gautrin, the question of the inner disposition of the analyst. One analyst of Chicago told me, for me, the question of the high frequency is not only a question of the patient, it's the question of my mind.
Exactly.
I work in my mind in a high frequency system. This is my inner way of working.
The time
is finished.
Yes. We would like to thank you so much, both Alain and Jorge, for your brilliant presentation, for your so interesting, lively, and clear discussion. Thank you all the participants for your presence and vivid participation. Our next webinar is in March with Marie Eisenstein, who will present her ideas on today's psychopathology and the fundamentals of psychoanalysis. We're looking forward to see you in March, and thank you very much. Thank you both, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Eliana, for your work as a moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you, Jorge.
Goodbye.
Bye.